All right, my BIBLEin365 brothers and sisters, we are now at the first book of the New Testament, which is Matthew. Now, we know that Matthew is a Jew who is writing to Jews about a specific Jew, right? Now, that's very important to note because you need to understand that of all the books, the very specific focus in the book of Matthew is to show his fellow countrymen that Christ is the fulfillment of prophecy concerning their Messiah, and his whole objective is to demonstrate Christ as the King of the Jews. That's very, very important for us to pay attention to, and I think it is absolutely critical because if we miss that point, we are going to miss very critical aspects of what Matthew does. Now, we know that this is important, and we know that he's writing to Jews because he's doing things that were very important to Jews during that day. Specifically, he does one thing that creates a massive problem for who Jesus is, and he gets into a genealogy. We're going to talk about that genealogy in a second when we talk about the difficult portion of Matthew, which, by the way, there are many what are called difficult portions of Matthew, but I am actually going to call the most difficult portion perhaps the genealogy section, and Matthew 24 tends to be the one that everybody calls the more difficult area, but quite frankly, I think that's easy because I live in the Bible prophecy world, and I absolutely love this stuff. So we'll leave it at that. We'll talk about Matthew 24 in just a second. We need to spend a little bit of time with that. And of course, we'll talk about some tools that you can go chase after to learn about the prophecies in Matthew 24 because they are important. Okay. With that said, let me just simply say this because this is really, really, really critical for us to be able to grasp and understand. Okay. Matthew spends a lot of time quoting from the Old Testament in order to establish that Jesus is the Messiah. He does that more than the other gospel writers, and it's very important that we understand that. More than 130 times in the book of Matthew, we see him using quotations that allude to the Old Testament to show that Jesus meets the qualifications of being the one who is going to save everybody as the Bible predicted in the Old Testament. He often uses this phrase, which we also see this phrase being employed in other contexts, but the most common times that this phrase is used is in Matthew, where he says, that which was spoken through the prophets, that this might be fulfilled. And I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but that which was spoken through the prophets is perhaps the more significant portion of that phrase. He says it a lot, right? He also uses the phrase son of David quite a few times, which is his, I think, I'm not going to use the term prerogative, but it is, I think, sort of, I guess I could use prerogative. It is his idea, and I believe that it is his heart to want to spend some time to make sure that terms associated with the Messiah were being used so that everybody who was reading what he said would absolutely understand it. And I think it's really, really, really critical. And let me just tell you why that's so important. 9 times in the book of Matthew, he uses that term, okay? 9 times. Yet, you might not think that's a big deal, but if you take the next 3 gospel accounts that were written, right? Mark, Luke, and John, and you put them all together, they only used it 6 times in between all 3 of those gospels. And these things matter. Listen, when you study the Bible, you need to count phrases and you need to really consider these things because you need to learn and understand how things are emphasized. By the way, in our Bible study seminar that we're going to be doing, we'll be doing the first quarter of this year, I'm going to show you how to do all of that, show you how to pick out these tools and kind of give you an idea of all the things that are available to you to be able to understand these things a little bit better and why all of those things are important. So we're going to go over all of that, right? And I think it's really, really, really important, okay? Also, you need to understand that Matthew gives us the first record after 400 years of silence, where God doesn't speak at all, because Malachi would have been the last prophet of record before Matthew writes. And when he writes the book relatively early on. His gospel account is somewhere between, I would say, 58 and 64 AD, sometime around there. So I think that that is very, very important that we point that out. And also, Matthew was a unique person. Like, for example, we know that Matthew took some time to introduce his friends and fellow tax collectors to Jesus, which of course Jesus was condemned for being at that meeting, right, by the Pharisees, but he went out of his way to literally glorify God in any opportunity that he had because his life was so radically transformed. And remember, he was not liked by the people around him because he was a tax collector, or oftentimes referred to as a publican, right? Now, another interesting thought here about Matthew is the last time we see his name mentioned, it is in Acts chapter 1. And that's noteworthy because Matthew had a very unique and significant time period that God had used him in, and he was believed to have been martyred very, very early on. So he was a man that was uniquely used by God in a very powerful way to communicate a lot of things and to open up the minds and the hearts of so many people. Now, I do think that we should note this, and I've talked about this before in some of my other summaries. In the book of Matthew, the real turning point that we see things happening is in chapter 12, when the Pharisees meet this crossroads where they formally reject Christ. And in their formal rejection of Christ, what they end up doing is they end up making it very clear that it is their desire to destroy him, and they declare him as being of Satan and not of God, which of course makes things way crazy for them, of course, and their eternal being. But what's even more important is that changes the direction of Christ's ministry, in that he starts immediately speaking through parables. He does that a lot more after that had happened, right? Because now his focus is shifting on the disciples and the people that are listening to his conversation with the disciples. And as I said before, his increased attention is to his disciples. And he begins to repeat a lot more statements about his death because his time of death is near. And that was very, very significant, right? So I think all of this is important stuff to be mindful of. Now let's talk about some difficult passages, okay? The difficult passage in Matthew, or the two difficult passages in Matthew, when I say that, let's just say difficult chapters, happen to also be the two blessings in Matthew. Now, the one that I'm going to identify as the difficult one is Matthew chapter 1. And in Matthew chapter 1, what we get a genealogy. Now, this genealogy is critically important for us to pay attention to, because this genealogy makes some declarations about Jesus that are extremely, extremely disturbing, okay? Now, here's the issue. We have to go back to look at this, because if we don't look at this correctly, then we're going to make a major mistake. You have to go back to the genealogy, and you have to read through the genealogy, because as you read through the genealogy, what you're going to realize very quickly is in the genealogical account, you will find almost immediately that there is a person that is named in the genealogical account, and that person is Jehoniah. Now, some of you might know him as Honiah, and depending on what translation you see, it will be something like that. But here's the thing about Honiah. Here's the thing about Jehoniah. He was cursed by God. He came from the bloodline of David, but he was cursed by God, and God said that nothing good would ever come from his seed. His seed would be cursed. Well, there's a problem there, because if Jesus is named in the direct line of Jehoniah, then how can he be blessed? How can he be the Messiah? So this is really interesting, and it is a very viable question to ask. So when you look at it very closely, you begin to realize that this genealogy speaks of Joseph, who is, of course, Jesus's half-father. So this is where Joseph comes from. And then it's interesting, because when you go to the book of Luke, you also read about a genealogy of Joseph, but this happens to be Joseph, Mary's father. But when you look at the genealogy associated with Mary, Mary does come from King David, but comes from a different son of King David, because King David had lots of wives and he also had lots of sons. So that was a different bloodline. Now, why is that important to us? Well, it's important to us because the Bible tells us that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, number one. The other thing that we realize is that Christ came from Mary's body, came from Mary's womb, but Mary, if you remember, was inseminated by the Spirit of God, right? It was a supernatural siring that took place, and that's how we know Jesus had to have been the person that he claimed to have been, because if you think about it, Jesus's bloodline would not have been directly affected by what we read about in the genealogy of Matthew, but it would have been directly affected by the genealogy that we read about in Luke. And in Luke's genealogy, we don't touch Jehoniah at all, Remember, Joseph did not inseminate Mary in order for Jesus to be born. So this makes perfect sense. And what's even more incredible is that when the temple was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD, then the genealogical record was lost, at least the verifiable genealogical record. So the only genealogical records that we have is that which is given to us in the Bible, which are clear, accurate, and verified, which make it very clear that Christ is the Messiah and nobody else can claim that he's the Messiah, even if you base it on genealogical record. So that's why that's really cool. Now we get into the more problematic section of that genealogy, for example. And you can get very lost in it if you don't take into account Mary's genealogical record, and if you don't take into account the fact that, of course, the Bible tells us that Christ was born of a virgin. That's very, very important. Okay, now we get into chapter 24 of Matthew, and chapter 24 of Matthew deals with prophecies concerning the end times. I'm going to tell you this, it is a blessing. When you learn about this, it will give you confidence in the day in which you live. Learning Bible prophecy and studying Bible prophecy will embolden you to preach the gospel. It will teach you to do the type of thing that Charlie and Erica have dedicated their lives to doing, and that's standing up in the midst of a very corrupt world and a very corrupt nation. You get all of that when you study a place like Matthew chapter 24. So, for better understanding in Matthew chapter 24, go to jamescadiz.com, pull my recent Bible studies on Matthew 24. I just recently wrapped up Matthew. I did it literally a few months ago. You'll really appreciate it. You'll enjoy it. You'll be blessed by it. And I think you're going to love the book of Matthew. All right. There you go. We're a little late on this. We're sorry again. Genesis, Matthew, Psalms, and Proverbs are not going to have any post-production like I promised you. But after that, we will up our game a little bit. We had a significant problem with the production schedule, but it was more important for me to give you accurate content than it was to actually do a lot of post-production. So hopefully this will bless you guys. We love you. Again, you can go to jamescadiz.com. You can get more information on any of these Bible passages that I'm talking about, extensive teaching, and hopefully it'll bless you. Okay? Love you guys. Keep fighting the good fight. This journey is going to pay off. I promise you. God bless you.